I hadn't stepped into the attic in 17 years. Not since the night my wife, Mara, slid the key off her necklace and told me, smiling too quickly, "It's just old junk up there. Nothing worth your time." I believed her. I believed her because trust, once planted, grows roots you don't question until the ceiling starts to crack. The key fell out of her jewelry box the week after funeral. She died suddenly. A stroke, they said. One moment alive, the next reduced to condolences and casseroles. 17 years of marriage ended in a quiet hospital room where I held a hand that never squeezed back. I mourned her honestly. I defended her fiercely when people whispered about how distant she'd become near the end. I told myself love changes shape. I told myself locked doors don't always hide secrets, but grief has a way of demanding truth. On the 17th night after she was gone, I climbed the ladder. The lock clicked open too easily. Dust hung in the air like frozen breath. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, labeled in Mara's tidy handwriting. Taxes, winter clothes, college books, and then, in the far corner, a metal trunk with no label at all. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photographs. Not old, faded memories, but sharp, modern prints. A younger Mara pregnant. Mara in a hospital bed holding a newborn. Mara standing beside a man I had never seen before, his arm around her waist in a way that made my stomach drop. And then the worst one, the man, older now, standing beside a teenage boy who had my eyes. I froze. Beneath the photos were legal documents, birth records, school enrollment forms, a trust fund statement, letters tied with twine. I sat on the attic floor and read until my vision blurred. 17 years ago, while I was working double shifts to save for our house, Mara had been living a second life. She'd had a son, not mine. She'd hidden him away with his biological father, paying for everything in secret, our shared savings, my overtime, my sacrifices. And I had been the fool who kissed her goodnight while she mailed checks to another family. The boy's name was Daniel. He was 17 now. The last letter was dated 3 months before her death. "If anything happens to me," Mara had written, "promise you won't tell him who paid for his life. He deserves to love you as his uncle someday, not resent you." I laughed then. I laughed so hard I cried. Uncle. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call the man from the photos. I didn't tell friends or family. I did something far colder. I waited. Over the next 3 months, I quietly unraveled the life she had stitched together behind my back. The trust fund. I was the primary contributor and legally the sole owner. I froze it. The apartment she'd been paying for, under my name. I sold it. The private school tuition, canceled. I watched from a distance as panic set in. The man, his name was Victor, started selling things. Daniel transferred schools. Their comfortable life collapsed piece by piece, and they had no idea why. Then came the knock on my door. 3 months later. I opened it to find Victor standing there, thinner, older, desperate. Daniel stood beside him, confusion written across his face. "We need to talk," Victor said, voice shaking. "Please." I stepped aside and let them in. They begged. Victor told me everything, as if I didn't already know. He cried. He blamed fear. He blamed Mara. He said she loved us both in different ways, as if betrayal could be reorganized into poetry. Daniel just stared at me. Finally, he asked, "Did you know?" I looked him in the eyes, my eyes, and told him the truth. "I found out after she died." He swallowed hard. "So all this time you were paying for me?"
"Yes."
Victor dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'll do anything. We'll leave. Just please. He's my son." I felt nothing. I told them I had one condition. They had to listen. I explained how every dollar they'd lived on came from years of my labor. How every birthday gift, every school fee, every medical bill had been paid while I ate leftovers and skipped vacations. How my marriage had been a lie built on my exhaustion. Daniel was crying now. I turned to him gently. "None of this is your fault. But it is not my responsibility anymore." Victor reached for my hand. "Please, we're family." "No," I said calmly. "You are her secret, and secrets don't get inheritance." I gave Daniel a final envelope, college application resources, and a letter I'd written, explaining that I wished him a future free from lies, even if it wasn't funded by me. Then I opened the door. They left. I locked it behind them. Some people think revenge has to be loud, explosive, cruel. But the most powerful revenge is reclaiming what was stolen, your truth, your dignity, your life, and letting the people who lied to you face a world without your generosity holding them up. I went back to the attic one last time, carried the metal trunk downstairs, and burned everything in it. 17 years of secrets turned to ash. And for the first time since my wife died, I could finally breathe. 17 years of silence ended the moment his wife's jewelry box slipped from his hands and spilled across the bedroom floor. He had been sorting through her things slowly, carefully, as if moving too fast might erase the last traces of her presence. Grief had made him cautious, almost reverent. Each ring, each necklace carried a memory, a moment when she had smiled at him, teased him, or rested her head on his shoulder after a long day. Then he saw it, the small, dull brass key lying among the pearls and chains. A key he hadn't seen since the early years of their marriage. A key she had always worn close to her heart, and one she had once told him was nothing important. The memory came back with cruel clarity. 17 years earlier, he had asked about it, while standing at the foot of the ladder that led to the attic. She had laughed softly, kissed his cheek, and told him the attic was full of useless junk, things better left untouched. He had trusted her then. Trust had been easy in those days. He had believed love didn't need proof, and locked doors were just boundaries, not warnings. Now, standing alone in their quiet house, that belief felt fragile. That night, sleep refused to come. The house groaned and settled around him, every sound magnified by absence. Her side of the bed was cold. The key sat on the nightstand, catching the light each time he turned his head. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of all the years he had spent believing in a life that no longer felt whole. Just after midnight, he rose, heart pounding for reasons he didn't fully understand. The ladder creaked as he climbed, each step echoing in the hollow space of the house. The attic door loomed above him, untouched for nearly 2 decades, its lock dull with age and dust. His hand hesitated before inserting the key. Part of him wanted to stop, to put it back, to preserve the version of his wife that lived safely in his memories. But grief had sharpened into something else, an ache that demanded answers. The lock clicked. The sound was small, almost polite, but it shattered something inside him. As he pushed the door open, a cloud of dust drifted down, carrying the stale scent of old paper and forgotten time. The attic was darker than he remembered, the single bulb casting long, uneasy shadows across stacked boxes and covered furniture. Everything was arranged too neatly, too deliberately, as if someone had planned for this moment long ago. He stepped inside, his breath shallow, and felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a storage space. It felt like a shrine to something hidden, something preserved in silence. The air itself seemed heavy, expectant. That was when he understood. Whatever was in this attic wasn't nothing. It was 17 years of deliberate secrecy, sealed away behind a lock and a smile. His wife hadn't just closed a door. She had drawn a line between the man she lived with and the truth she lived for. As he stood there, alone beneath the low beams, he realized that opening the attic wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was the first step into a past he had never been allowed to know. A past that would change how he saw his marriage, his sacrifices, and the woman he thought he had loved completely. And though he didn't yet know what waited in the shadows, one thing was painfully clear: the moment the lock turned, the life he believed in was already gone. He didn't understand what he was looking at first. The photographs lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, their glossy surfaces catching the weak attic light. His eyes moved from one image to the next, searching for familiarity, for something that would reassure him this was all some strange misunderstanding. But with every picture he picked up, the truth sharpened, cutting deeper than he was prepared for. There she was, his wife, looking younger, softer, her smile unguarded in a way he hadn't seen in years. She was standing in a small hospital room, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. His breath caught. They had never had children. She had told him it was fate, that some things were simply not meant to be. Yet here she was, undeniably pregnant, undeniably glowing with a life he had never been allowed to share. He felt dizzy and sank onto an old wooden chair as more images revealed themselves. A newborn baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket, his wife's face glowing with exhaustion and love as she cradled the child. A man stood beside her in several photos, his arm around her shoulders, his presence intimate and unashamed. He was not a stranger in these moments. He belonged there in a way that made the viewer feel like the outsider. The man stared at the photographs until his hands trembled. His chest tightened, not just with jealousy, but with the crushing realization that this was not a single mistake or brief affair. This was a parallel life, carefully lived and carefully hidden. Birthdays, hospital visits, first steps, all the moments that defined a family, had unfolded without him, financed by years of his work and trust. As he sorted through the rest of the trunk, The evidence grew colder and more precise. Legal documents lay neatly stacked, their edges yellowed, but their words sharp. A birth certificate listed his wife as the mother and another man as the father. School enrollment forms showed the same unfamiliar name, year after year. Tuition receipts bore his signature indirectly, joint accounts, shared savings, funds he had believed were building a future for the two of them. Letters followed. Dozens of them, written in his wife's familiar handwriting, affectionate and practical all at once. She wrote about doctor appointments, school performances, scraped knees, and growing expenses. She wrote about love, fear, and the careful balance of keeping two worlds from colliding. In every line, she justified her choices, convincing herself that secrecy was kindness, that deception was protection. Then he saw the dates, 17 years ago. The same year he had taken on extra shifts. The same year he had given up his own dreams to stabilize their life. While he was building a home he thought they shared, she had been building another one in the shadows. The final photograph stopped him cold. A teenage boy stood beside the same man from the earlier pictures. The boy was tall, lean, his expression uncertain but familiar. The man's heart lurched as he recognized his own eyes staring back at him, from a face he had never seen before. The resemblance was cruel, almost mocking, as if life itself had decided to twist the knife a little deeper. He understood then why the attic had been locked, why her affection had sometimes felt divided, why certain conversations had ended too quickly, certain absences never fully explained. The truth was too large, too devastating to be allowed into the light. As he sat there surrounded by proof of a life that had excluded him entirely, love curdled into something bitter and heavy. He wasn't just betrayed as a husband. He was betrayed as a man who had given everything in good faith. Every sacrifice, every late night, every unasked question now felt like a brick in the wall she had built between them. In that silent attic, with dust settling around him, he realized that his marriage hadn't ended with her death. It had ended long before, sealed away in a locked room, waiting for the day he would finally be brave enough, or broken enough, to open it. The shock did not fade when he left the attic. It followed him downstairs, sat with him at the kitchen table, and stared back at him from the dark window as dawn began to creep in. Sleep never came. His mind replayed 17 years of memories, now corrupted, each one demanding to be re-examined. Every late shift he had worked, every vacation postponed, every promise of later, suddenly carried a different meaning. What he once believed were sacrifices for love were, in truth, payments for a life he was never meant to see. At first, anger surged hot and uncontrollable. He paced the house, clenching his fists, imagining confrontations that could never happen. His wife was gone. There would be no shouting, no explanations, no apologies. The rage had nowhere to land. Slowly, that anger cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous, clarity. He began to think not as a grieving husband, but as a man taking inventory of what had been taken from him. The trust fund documents from the attic replayed in his mind. The apartment leases. The tuition payments. All of it had flowed from accounts with his name on them. Not once had he questioned the withdrawals. Love had made him careless. Now reason took its place. He spent days quietly reviewing bank statements, legal records, and old emails. Each discovery confirmed what he already knew: the life she had hidden was propped up entirely by his labor. His overtime hours had paid for birthdays he never attended. His savings had built a home he had never stepped into. Even the future she had planned for the boy, college, security, stability, was funded by a man she never trusted enough to tell the truth. There was no dramatic decision, no moment of thunder or tears. Just a calm, deliberate resolve. He would stop it all. He contacted a lawyer first, framing his questions carefully, neutrally. The answers came back clear and devastating. The trust fund was legally his. The properties were in his name. The payments were voluntary, not obligated. The life they lived existed at his discretion, and that discretion had been abused. So he withdrew it, one account at a time, one automatic payment canceled after another. He didn't announce it. He didn't warn anyone. He simply reclaimed what had been given under false pretenses. Each click of confirmation felt like cutting a thread, and with every thread severed, the weight on his chest lightened just a little. Over the following weeks, he imagined the confusion on the other side, the sudden rejection of cards, the unanswered calls, the overdue notices. He didn't take pleasure in it, but he didn't stop it either. This was not revenge driven by cruelty, it was justice shaped by restraint. 3 months passed. In that time, he changed too. He cleaned the house of her things, donating clothes, throwing away what he could not bear to keep. He started cooking meals for one. He slept through the night again. With every practical step, he reclaimed a piece of himself that had been quietly drained away for years. He never once reached out to them, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Generosity without honesty is not kindness, it is exploitation. And love that demands silence is not love at all. When the final payment was canceled, he sat back and exhaled deeply. The system she had built so carefully collapsed without noise, without spectacle. No accusations, no public shame, just absence. And in that absence, he found something unexpected: peace. He didn't feel like a villain. He felt like a man who had finally stepped out of a lie and into his own life. The revenge, if it could even be called that, was quiet and complete. Not destruction, but withdrawal. Not punishment, but release. For the first time in 17 years, everything he earned belonged to him again. The collapse did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a building losing its supports one beam at a time. At first, it was small inconveniences, things that could be brushed off as banking errors or temporary delays. A card declined at a grocery store, a tuition reminder email marked urgent, a landlord asking why the transfer hadn't arrived yet. Confusion came before fear, and denial lingered longer than it should have. From a distance, he watched, not through cameras or spying, but through the quiet ripples that reached him anyway. Returned mail, legal notices addressed to properties he no longer owned, a voicemail from an unfamiliar number that he deleted without listening to. Each sign confirmed that the carefully maintained illusion was cracking. The life she had engineered in secrecy could not survive without the steady flow of money she had siphoned from his trust. Victor scrambled. He tried to fill the gaps at first, taking on extra work, selling small items, convincing himself this was temporary. He told Daniel it was just a rough patch, that adults sometimes had problems that sorted themselves out. But weeks passed, and nothing sorted itself out. The private school made it clear: no payment, no attendance. The apartment manager was less patient. Notices were taped to the door, polite at first, then firm. Daniel felt the change most sharply. Teenagers sense instability even when adults try to hide it. He noticed the tension in Victor's voice, the way conversations stopped when he entered the room. He noticed dinners shrinking, the silence stretching longer each night. His world, once predictable and safe, began to tilt. Questions went unanswered. Promises were postponed. The future he had assumed was solid suddenly felt fragile. And still, neither of them knew why. That was the cruel elegance of it. There was no enemy to fight, no explanation to argue against. Just absence. Support that had always been there was suddenly gone. And they were left to face the reality they had never planned for: life without the invisible hand holding everything up. By the second month, desperation replaced confusion. Victor called banks, lawyers, anyone who might explain what had happened. He retraced old arrangements, old favors, old understandings that had never been written down because secrecy had been their foundation. And secrecy, he learned too late, offers no protection when the truth withdraws. Daniel changed too. His grades slipped. He stopped talking about college with certainty. The confidence he had carried as a boy who believed his path was secure eroded into quiet anxiety. He began to feel like a burden, though no one said the words aloud. Children often blame themselves when adults fail them. Meanwhile, the man whose money had built their life moved on in silence. He didn't celebrate their struggle. He didn't gloat. He simply lived. Mornings became lighter. Evenings calmer. For the first time in years, his resources went toward his own healing rather than sustaining a lie. By the third month, the truth could no longer be avoided. The apartment was gone. School was no longer an option. Bills stacked up like accusations. Victor finally said the name he had avoided for weeks, the man whose generosity had once felt endless, whose presence had always existed at a safe distance. The husband. The realization hit like cold water. Everything they had relied on traced back to him. The comfort, the stability, the future. And with that realization came fear, because they knew exactly why it had vanished. That was when guilt arrived, heavy and unavoidable. Victor understood then that the man he had benefited from had never consented to this life. That every check had been written in ignorance. That every advantage Daniel had enjoyed came at the cost of another man's trust. The shame of it bent him low, leaving no room for excuses. And so, with nowhere else to turn, they did the only thing left: they went to him. Not with confidence, not with entitlement, but with empty hands and bowed heads, carrying the full weight of a life collapsing under the truth it had tried so hard to hide. When the knock finally came, it was softer than he expected. Not desperate, not angry, just hesitant, like the person on the other side already knew they had no right to be there. He stood in the hallway for a long moment before opening the door, steadying his breath. He had imagined this scene in fragments, but now that it was real, he felt strangely calm. Victor stood on the porch, thinner, his shoulders slumped as if carrying invisible weight. His eyes were rimmed red, not just from lack of sleep, but from months of quiet failure. Beside him stood Daniel, taller than he had been in the photographs, awkward in the way boys are when they're forced to grow up too fast. The resemblance struck him immediately. His eyes, his brow, the same thoughtful distance in the gaze. It felt like looking at a reflection that belonged to another life. Neither of them spoke at first. Victor broke the silence by stepping forward, his voice cracking. "I know I shouldn't be here, but we didn't know where else to go." The man stepped aside without a word and let them in. They sat at the dining table, the same one where he and his wife had once planned vacations, argued about paint colors, talked about a future that now felt fictional. Victor's hands trembled as he spoke. He told the story from the beginning, stripping away excuses, no longer trying to make it sound noble or necessary. He admitted the fear, the agreement to keep things hidden, the years of accepting money he knew was never truly his. Each word sounded like a confession offered too late. "I never meant for it to go this far," Victor said, tears finally spilling. "She said you knew. She said you were okay with it." The man didn't interrupt. He let the lie collapse under its own weight. Then Daniel spoke, his voice quieter, steadier than his father's. "I didn't know," he said, "about you, about any of this." He looked up, eyes searching. "Did you hate us?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. "No," the man answered honestly, "but I was lied to. For a long time." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "I figured something was wrong when everything stopped. I just didn't know why." That was when the truth came fully into the room. The man told Daniel who he was, what he had found, and why the money had ended. He did not soften it, but he did not make it cruel. He spoke of trust, of choice, of consequences. He made one thing clear above all else: none of this was the boy's fault. Victor sank to his knees then, the sound of it sharp against the floor. "Please," he said, voice breaking completely. "I'll work, I'll sign anything. Just don't punish him for what we did." The man looked down at him, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, only finality. "I didn't punish you?" he said quietly. "I stopped being used." He turned to Daniel and slid an envelope across the table. Inside were resources, contacts, guidance he had prepared, not money, but opportunity. "A bridge, not a crutch. You deserve a future built on truth," he said. "But it can't be built on my silence anymore." Daniel's hands shook as he took it. Tears fell freely now, but there was gratitude in his eyes too, gratitude mixed with loss, and the painful beginning of understanding. Victor tried to speak again, but the man stood and opened the door. "This is where it ends?" he said calmly. "For all of us." They left without another word. As the door closed, he felt something loosen inside him, not joy, not victory, but release. The truth had been spoken, the begging had ended, and for the first time since opening the attic, he knew he had done the hardest thing of all. He had chosen dignity over bitterness. And that choice, more than any punishment, was the moment his revenge was complete. After they left, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the hollow silence that followed his wife's death, not the suffocating stillness that had pressed on him when the truth first came to light. This quiet felt earned, honest. He stood by the door for a long moment, his hand still resting on the handle, listening to the sound of their footsteps fade away. With them went the last living ties to the secret that had haunted him for months. He didn't feel triumphant. That surprised him. For a while, he had imagined revenge as something sharp and satisfying, a moment that would finally make the pain feel balanced. But standing alone in his living room, he realized revenge had already happened, not in anger, not in cruelty, but in choice. He had chosen not to scream, not to destroy, not to become the villain in someone else's story. He had chosen himself. That night he slept deeply for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, he rebuilt his life in small, deliberate ways. Mornings became his own. He drank his coffee slowly, no longer rushing out the door to earn money that would disappear into a lie. He took walks in the evening, noticing things he had ignored for years. The sound of birds settling at dusk, the way the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Peace, he learned, often arrives quietly. He cleared out the attic last. Box by box, he carried down the remnants of a life that had been split in two. He didn't rage or cry as he worked. He sorted, discarded, and donated with calm precision. The metal trunk that had held the truth stood empty at the end. When he finally closed it, it felt like closing a chapter that no longer had power over him. He didn't hate his wife. That truth took time to accept. Hatred would have been easier, cleaner. But what he felt instead was clarity. She had loved him in her way, just not enough to trust him with the truth. And that failure was hers to carry, not his to excuse, and not his to continue paying for. People around him noticed the change. Friends said he looked lighter, straighter, as if some invisible weight had finally been set down. He smiled more, not the polite, practiced smile of obligation, but the genuine kind that comes when nothing is being hidden. He began making plans again, small ones at first, then bigger ones. Travel, hobbies, a future that belonged solely to him. Sometimes he thought of Daniel, not with regret, but with a quiet hope. He hoped the boy would take the envelope seriously, that he would build a life anchored in truth rather than comfort. He hoped he would learn early what it had taken him 17 years to understand, that nothing given without consent is a gift, and nothing built on lies can last. He never heard from them again. And that, too, felt right. The real revenge wasn't taking the money back. It wasn't watching a hidden life collapse. It was refusing to let betrayal define the rest of his story. It was reclaiming his time, his effort, his generosity, and deciding exactly where they would go from now on. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, he realized something else. He was free, free from secrecy, free from obligation born of deception, free from carrying the consequences of choices that were never his. What remained was not bitterness, but space to live honestly, to love carefully, and to never again ignore the warning signs of a locked door and an easy smile. 17 years had been taken from him, but the rest of his life was finally his own. And that was the most powerful revenge of all.